Hello and welcome back to the third session in our extended reality lecture series, where we will cover the topic of photorealism. Before we start, we can quickly remind ourselves about the previously covered topics regarding reality-virtuality continuum and the perpetual process that was introduced by Goldstein. When we covered the topic about reality-virtuality continuum, we went through the terms such as augmented reality, augmented virtuality, mixed reality, and so on, mainly focusing on the visual aspect and the amount of modeled work, which is why we introduced the modeling section as one of the main criteria. However, when we took a look at the Goldstein perpetual process, we introduced the criteria of interaction and later on the criteria of immersion in order to emphasize the lack of proper boundaries for determining each of the terms within reality-virtuality continuum. So, since the virtual environment is supposed to mimic the real-world environment, in today's session, we will talk about what makes the real environment real, or what is a realistic depiction. In order to answer this question, we can take a look at Pliny's book called Natural History, where he introduces the story of Zeuxis and Parrhasius. In short, Zeuxis is a painter extraordinaire for his time, and there is a painting competition which Parrhasius is invited to. The face-off between these two painters goes like this. Zeuxis paints a realistic depiction of grapes, so realistic that the birds arrive to taste its juices. When we take a look at Parrhasius's painting, we can see a curtain depiction. Zeuxis tells him to reveal the photo that's obviously being hidden under the curtain, but realizes the error in his judgment where the curtain is actually the painting, which means that even though Zeuxis was the one who fooled the birds, Parrhasius is the one who fooled the painter. So we can dive into this topic of realistic depictions by trying to understand what a realistic depiction or a realistic image is. And we can take a look at this book, Texturing and Modeling, a procedural approach, where it is said that a realistic image is an age-old question in art, but a contemporary question in computer graphics, for obvious reasons. We can take another glance at the algorithms and principles of non-photorealistic graphics and try to combine the cumulative knowledge from these two books in order to try and understand what a realistic depiction is. In this book, there is a quote which says, "Thus, a new type of quest has emerged, creating imagery that is more effective at conveying information, expressive or beautiful, rather than just being physically realistic." So within this book, we introduced something that is beyond the scope of realistic. So if we understand what that scope is, we can reverse engineer the realistic term as well. So we can tackle the topic from both sides. So in this book, there is a class of terms regarding visual representation. There are three of those which start with an image. The word image is defined by Webster's dictionary as an optical counterpart or duplicate, which means that we are actually creating something that already exists, objectively the same. So if we take a look at this photo, we can see an upside down realistic image and an opening on the right-hand side of the room. So what is afoot here? We are basically looking at camera obscura, which is a concept that emerged centuries ago and basically translated from Latin means the dark room. So if we have an opening in the wall, such as this, we can have an optical counterpart or a duplicate on the wall on the other side, since the light rays are entering it and creating the image on the wall. However, if the opening is too small, the image will not be as bright. If we enlarge the opening, we will have a brighter image, but it will be blurrier since a larger amount of rays will pass through the same point, creating a fuzzy edge. It is even said that Jan Vermeer, a painter, used camera obscura in his paintings because of a very prolific approach to perspective. However, no hard evidence have been found. Another term within the visual representation scope is visualization, which is defined as the act or process of interpreting in visual terms, or putting in visual forms. So if we take a look at this example, this is taken from the movie Prometheus, where we see a point-based visualization of past events, which are shown as holograms to the protagonists of the movie. So the visualization is more subjective because you can add or visualize something that doesn't even exist, which also includes data. So while the image is objectively defined as being a duplicate or an optical counterpart of visualization, on the other hand, basically can give visual depictions to something that doesn't have a form, such as data in this case. Lastly, we have picture as the third term that is introduced regarding the visual representations. And a picture is described as a design or representation or a description so vivid and graphic that it can create a mental image or give an accurate idea of something. That means that, for example, if we take a look at this photo, which was done by Steve McCurry in 1985, which shows the Afghan girl during the Afghanistan war, and it shows a photo which has a good composition. It's an optical duplicate since it was taken by a camera, but it also delivers a message. It is considered the first world's third world Mona Lisa. So we can have this strong mental image or the description that's attached to a photo or to an image, and that's when it becomes a picture. So when you add something subjective to it as well. So in this example, we can see the picture that George Djokovic took, which is called Life on the Other Side, where we can see a small Roma girl in the window aisle looking at a children's birthday party, where we can sense some feeling which cannot be explained objectively. So the objective part with the image is closely related to our subjective feeling when we take a look at this situation and what we might feel in it. The same thing can be said for an image where we can actually hear what is being said, even though we can't hear something within the picture. So the question must be asked, which type of a visual representation are we supposed to use? An image, which is an objective duplicate or an optical counterpart, a visualization where we can add all of our subjective opinions and basically depict abstract things, or a picture which is something in between. So in order to answer this question, we should take a look at what objective and subjective mean within the scopes of visual representation. In the book by Gang, we can take a look at what objective and subjective actually means within the scope of visual representations. So as Gang says, the major goal of photorealistic rendering is to generate images that mimic the effect of a traditional photographic camera. It depicts only what I see. So that's an objective part within it. So, for example, we can take a look at a tree and it objectively is there because it has some substance. We talked about this, what a real object is, and it exists there whether or not we believe in it. On the other hand, we have a subjective depiction of visual representations, which basically means a non-photorealistic rendering, which not only depicts what I see, but also depicts what I know, which is a very important part, which means that we are adding our own experiences and subjective feelings to an objective image so we can depict a certain message. So in the prior example, we can see that humans can take a look at the tree and depict different things. For example, just observe a tree or think about its fruits, or think about it as a resource to be used, bought, sold, and so on. So in order to understand the difference between the objective and subjective things, we can take a look at two books which are fiction and physics. So on one hand, we have the Harry Potter franchise, which is subjective, but on the other hand, we have the physics book, which is an objective truth, whether we believe in it or not. So if we make an experiment where we delete all the common knowledge or all the books from our joined memory, in 100 years' time, we will have maybe different writings, but the same postulates and the same things in the physics books, while the depictions given in science fiction or fictional books will be different since it's based on subjective things. So if we want to apply the objective and subjective definitions as a criteria for analyzing an architectural rendering, we can take a look at a structure and know that this is something that will never be seen in this way. So we cannot see the traffic going by this far, or a fixed position for the leaves, or this amount of lighting in a particular part of the day, and so on. So this is giving a subjective feeling to transfer or give away the atmosphere to the potential client while still preserving the objective parts of the structure. So in this example, we can take a look at objective things such as diffuse color, ambient occlusion, global illumination, shadows, but then we can see the hatch lines and the blurry paintings that depict subjective ways of showing paintings that exist within the realm of art. So combination of objective and subjective things always portrays the atmosphere and the depiction best, which basically means that we are creating a picture in this case. If we take a look at interactive visualization examples or examples from games, we can observe that we have a yellow glow or highlight around certain objects, which gives us a clue that we can interact with them. So that is the part of not only what I see, but also what I know. So what I can do with these objects. So to have proper pictures or visual depictions that cover both objective and subjective parts, we can first take a look at the objective part, which is something that is defined as photorealism. The term photorealism was coined back in 1969, which was done by the founder of the movement, who said that when asked by the museum curator Jim Monty what I call these painters who used photographs to gather the information they needed for their work, he said, probably photographic realists, or better yet, photorealists. In his book, Photorealism, which was published in 1989, and another book, Photorealism in the Digital Age, he talks about the basic principles of this movement, which are that the photorealists uses the camera and photograph to gather the information, that the photorealists uses a mechanical or semi-mechanical means to transfer the information to the canvas, and that they must have the technical ability to make the finished work appear photographic. The other two principles dive deeper into the exclusiveness of being part of this movement, so we can just focus on the parts that are interesting for us, which is that the basic principle is to use the camera, mechanical or semi-mechanical means, and to make something appear photographic. So we can take a look at this big self-portrait by Chuck Close, which was done in 1967-68, which was done as we've seen from the principles by using photographs to gather the information and then combining them together. Chuck Close said that I decided to work from the photograph so I can accept some things as a given. So I wouldn't have to think about composing. I wouldn't have to think about the invention of shapes. So in this case, it was more of a commodity or something to ease up the pressure of creating an actual painting from scratch. So it means that we have to focus on the details. For example, he said that when he was doing this part, he had a seam line somewhere in here, and only after he had finished the other portion had he noticed this white trail, which was actually the smoke coming off the cigarette. So that means that a very high attention needs to be paid to details, which we know is something that was practiced highly by the architect Mies van der Rohe in his saying that the God is in details. So once we've taken a look at the principles that existed more than 50 years ago, we can observe it through the lens of contemporary practices in computer graphics. So first off, we can take a look at the 3D photorealism toolkit, which was published by Bill Fleming, where he discusses these 10 things in order to make a photorealistic depiction of something within the computer graphics scope. So clutter and chaos, personality and expectations, believability, surface texture, specularity, dirt and dust and rust, flaws, scratches and dings, beveled edges, object material depth, and radiosity. So when they are presented like this, there are no categories or clusters where we can put multiple things together and then work from a top-down approach by just observing the things and then working our way from one to the other. That approach was done by James Brenton in his doctoral dissertation called Photorealism Within Interior Architectural Images, where he specified that basically architects can only use three major things, which is geometry, texture, and lighting. So if we now try to combine these two things, we can take a look at the 10 principles introduced by Fleming, and then these three categories basically that were introduced by Brenton. So if we wanted to place certain principles into the category of geometry, where will it fit? You can write your answers in the comments below. In this case, I chose the clutter and chaos, the beveled edges, and the object material depth. Again, these parts are not described objectively. They have some portion of a subjective feel to it, which is why the answers you might have will not coincide with what I have shown here. When taking a look at the textures, you can also write your prognosis as to what it might be, but in this case, it was chosen to be surface texture, dirt, dust, and rust, and flaws, scratches, and dings. And lastly, we have the parts that are in reference to lighting, which is specularity and radiosity in this case. In the end, when we take a look at geometry, texture, and lighting, we can observe that two of the principles, such as personality and expectations and believability, are left unclassified, as far as I'm concerned at least, because they can be applied to each of these clusters or categories or classes. So the personality and expectations can be in reference to geometry, textures, and lighting, as well as believability. So when Brenton said that you can only use global illumination, accurate object representation, chaos, and imperfections, he also introduced subjective parts in his writing, especially when we observe the accurate object representation, which doesn't have an objective definition, but a subjective one when portrayed like this. Moving on, we can take a look at Alex Roman's book that was published in 2013 called From Bits to the Lens. You can also check out his video, which is called The Third and the Seventh, where he uses the 6 principles, or mentions these 6 principles: modeling, materials, lighting, and render, but also introduces nature, composition, and post-productions. So we can see that modeling, materials, and lighting is a common thing that we can see in these 3 works thus far. If we take a look at a case of integrating principles of photography, we can see that these 6 principles deal with the camera. So the depth of field and the motion blur and the composition, or the rules of third, are highly intricate things and something that is connected to the camera. Lighting and shadows is closely related to the camera and its exposure. And then we have the basic design understanding, which is also subjectively defined in this case. If we take a look at the vast resources we have available on the internet with online articles, we can take a look at this 3D rendering and photorealism, 10 best practices and tips, where we have these 10 practices, but given the audience and the layman terms they have to use, this is very vague for any actual application. So we can see that bevel application is something that is repeated, but photometric lighting and blurred background effects make things much easier, is nothing more than depth of field. So it lacks certain professional terminology, which is understandable given that the laymen should be able to understand this. But in some cases, the extremes go from chromatic aberration, which perhaps is not as important as some of the main things that are not mentioned in this case. Lastly, we can take a look at the experts who have been using and making photorealistic depictions, such as Blender Guru, who published a video called Photorealism Explained, where he mentions that you should have 4 building blocks of photorealism, which are the modeling as a basis, then the materials, lighting, and post-processing. So when we take a look at his parts, like modeling, materials, and lighting, which is something that has been mentioned in the previous works, and the post-production, we can add to it the camera and the rendering engine, and have these 6 principles as something that is important to create photorealistic depictions. However, their order might change. So if we take a look, the post-production definitely should be in the end. And in some cases, the rendering engine is the one that should be chosen at the start, because it influences the materials, the lighting, and the camera as well, given that all are intertwined to produce the best results. So once we've taken a look at all the cumulative knowledge from these resources, we can try and create our own structure based on the previously written things in this type of a visual depiction, where we have geometry as the basis of these pillars, and then we have the pillars which take a larger amount of the scene, and then the intertwined nature between camera and lighting, and lastly, the post-production, which puts everything together. But now we are only missing the rendering engine. So which part of this structure do you think it belongs to? In my depiction, the rendering engine is something that completely changes the depiction of the structure, but while leaving it the same. So if you use Maxwell, or you use Arnold, or you use RenderMan, or you use V-Ray, or you do it in Unreal Engine or Mental Ray, the results may vary in reference to the rendering engine you might use. So with these 6 principles, we have a good grasp on the objective parts that are needed to create photorealistic renderings, and the subjective things can be something that we introduce to deliver our message and create the atmosphere we would like for our clients or the users of our product. So in the next video, we can take a look at how these principles can be upgraded for the extended reality application that is part of this lecture series and put it in the scope of real-time rendering. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you in the next video.